The mud of Pennsylvania had a particular genius for malice. It was not the honest, churned mire of a Flanders field nor the chalky slurry of an English lane after a spring shower. This was a cold, sullen clay that clung to a man's boots with the suction of a dying breath, stealing warmth and strength with every step. For Private Thomas Barker of His Majesty's 40th Regiment of Foot, it was the sound of defeat. Not the roar of cannon or the crackle of musketry at Germantown. That was the sound of war, a thing he understood. This was the squelch and drag of a dozen pairs of broken boots, a sound that spoke of a long, ignominious trudge into the heart of a rebel wilderness. January 1778. The name of the place was a rumor, a mumble from the bearded militia guards who walked beside their column, muskets held with a farmer's casual competence. Bethlehem, or some such German-sounding name, a place of saints, one of the guards had said, which seemed a poor joke to men whose bellies were filled with little more than cold air and dread. They were what was left of a company scattered in the fog and confusion of the assault on the Chew House, captured not in a glorious stand, but rounded up in pockets, disarmed in the gray damp of an autumn morning that had promised victory. Sergeant Whitaker, his face a roadmap of old campaigns, kept the rhythm. His voice, though hoarse, had lost none of its gravelly authority. Heads up, lads. Ice front. You are soldiers of the king, not vagrants. Let these farmers see what a British regular looks like. It was a hard command to obey. Barker's eyes were fixed on the boots of the man in front of him, William Hargreaves, watching the clay suck and release, suck and release. He tried to think of his home parish in Lincolnshire, of the flat, honest earth and the wide sky. But the cold had a way of shrinking a man's world down to the next step, the next shiver that racked his frame. The stories they'd been told in barracks in Philadelphia were a litany of horrors. Rebels gave no quarter. They tortured prisoners, starved them in derelict ships, or turned them over to their savage allies. Every shadow in the dripping woods that flanked the road seemed to hold a painted face, a waiting tomahawk. The town, when they finally reached it, was a profound disappointment to their fears. There was no grim fortress, no prison hulk moored on a river. It was a settlement of plain, sturdy buildings of gray stone and dark timber, laid out with an unnerving sense of order. A large meeting house, a mill whose wheel was frozen in ice, and houses from which columns of wood smoke rose straight into the windless, iron-gray sky. There was a stockade, but its sharpened logs looked new, more suited to penning cattle than containing a company of the 40th Foot. The townspeople who emerged to watch their arrival were as unervingly plain as their buildings. The men were in drab homespun, the women in bonnets and shawls. There was no jeering, no spitting, no celebratory gunfire. They simply stood and watched, their faces impassive, their silence more unsettling than any shouted insult. It felt like being appraised by judges or, worse, by prospective buyers at a cattle market. A tall man with a full gray beard and a flat-brimmed hat met their small contingent of guards. He didn't wear a uniform, only a heavy wool coat against the biting air. He and the militia leader spoke in low tones. The gray-bearded man's gaze swept over the prisoners, lingering for a moment on each face. It was not a look of hatred or even triumph. It was one of weary assessment, the look of a man measuring a task he did not want but would see done properly. "They are your charge now, friend Elias," the militia captain said, his relief palpable. The man, Elias, nodded slowly. He gestured toward a long stone building that might have been a storehouse or a workshop. "Bring them to the wash-house first," he said, his voice calm and even. "They'll have the fever on them if we don't get the road and the camp off them." Sergeant Whitaker stiffened. "My men are not diseased." Elias's gaze met the sergeant's. There was no challenge in it, just a quiet statement of fact. "All men carry the seeds of it in such conditions, friend. We will not have it take root here. It is for their health as much as ours." Friend. The word was so odd, so out of place. It was not the address one expected from a jailer. As they were herded toward the stone building, Barker felt a new kind of fear creep in, colder and deeper than the dread of the tomahawk. It was the fear of the unknown, of a world that did not operate by the rules of king and subject, of soldier and enemy. The silence of the town felt like the held breath before a verdict. From the Journal of Private Thomas Barker. 12th day of January, Anno Domini 1778. Marched near 20 mile to this place. A settlement of sober folk who call themselves Moravians or some such. They looked upon us not with hate, but as if we were a sickly flock brought to their pen. We are promised clean quarters, but I fear it is a trick. A man can fight a blow, but what defense has he against a quiet eye? The sergeant says to keep our pride. It is a thin cloak against this Pennsylvanian cold. The washhouse was a low-ceilinged room, thick with the damp, mineral smell of stone and water. A huge iron kettle sat over a fire at one end, sending thick plumes of steam into the already humid air. Several large wooden barrels stood in a line on the slatted floor. Elias and two other men, equally plain in their dress, directed them inside. "Strip your clothes," Elias said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Leave them in the pile. You'll get a new issue." This was it, the moment of humiliation. To be stripped naked before your captors was the first step in breaking a man, erasing the soldier and leaving only the helpless prisoner. Barker saw Hargreaves hesitate, his hands hovering over the buttons of his tattered red coat. Sergeant Whitaker stood ramrod straight, his jaw tight. "Do as he says, lads," Whitaker bit out, his voice strained. "We'll shoe them, we've nothing to be ashamed of." He began to unfasten his own uniform, his movements stiff and deliberate, as if on the parade ground. One by one, they stripped, the cold air raising gooseflesh on their pale, underfed bodies. They were a sorry sight, a collection of bony shoulders, bruised limbs, and the long-healed scars of older fights. They piled their uniforms, the proud red coats now stained with mud and blood, into a heap that looked like a butcher's refused pile. The act felt like a surrender more final than the laying down of their muskets. But the expected mockery never came. Elias and his men worked with an efficient, impersonal rhythm. They handed each prisoner a small, hard cake of brown soap. The smell was sharp, acrid. "Lye soap," Elias said, noticing Barker's hesitation. "It will sting where the skin is broken, but it will kill the vermin." One man to a barrel. They climbed into the barrels, the hot water a shocking, painful pleasure on their frozen limbs. The steam billowed around them, obscuring the room in a shifting fog. For a few moments, Barker was alone in his own small world of heat and vapor, the sting of the lye soap a fierce, cleansing fire on his skin. He scrubbed away weeks of grime, the filth of the campaign, the sweat of fear. It was a brutal sort of baptism. When they were done, another man came through the steam with shears. He was methodical, his hands sure and swift. He cropped their hair close to the scalp, the locks falling onto the wet floorboards. Again, Barker braced for the taunt, the reference to a shorn sheep. But the man said nothing, simply moved from one prisoner to the next, his expression one of neutral concentration. It was not an act of degradation. It was an act of sanitation. They were given rough towels of unbleached linen and told to dry themselves. As Barker stepped out of the barrel, his skin red and tingling, he took his first deep breath. The air was clean, filled only with the scent of steam and the faint, sharp smell of the lye. The oppressive odor of unwashed bodies, of stale sweat and sickness that had been their constant companion for months, was gone. Felt like shedding a second, fouler skin. Dressed in loose-fitting linen shirts and breeches of a coarse, gray-brown wool, they looked nothing like soldiers. They were anonymous, stripped of regiment and rank. Yet, paradoxically, Barker felt more human than he had in weeks. The warmth was seeping back into his bones. The constant, maddening itch of lice was gone. He was clean. It was a simple, profound restoration. Sergeant Whitaker stood apart, his arms crossed over his new shirt. His face was a thundercloud of suspicion. He saw the trick where Barker was beginning to see none. This was a more subtle way of breaking them, he would later argue in the barracks. To strip them of their uniforms was to strip them of their allegiance, to make them forget they were the king's men. But as they were led from the steam-filled washhouse into the crisp, cold air, Barker felt a sense of clarity he couldn't deny. The world seemed sharper, the gray sky brighter. The act had not been one of humiliation, but of preparation. It was a reset, a scouring of the past. They were being made ready for something, but for what, he could not yet fathom. The plain, ordered decency of it was a weapon he did not know how to fight. He had been prepared for cruelty, for chains and starvation. He had not been prepared for soap and hot water. Their new quarters were the upper floor of a large barn, the air sweet with the scent of hay and seasoned wood. Clean straw had been laid down for bedding, and each man was given a thick woolen blanket. It was a greater comfort than any barracks they had occupied since leaving England. Below, through the floorboards, they could hear the soft shuffling and lowing of cattle, a sound of profound and gentle peace. As dusk settled, bringing a deeper cold, one of the guards, a young man with a serious face, brought in a large, steaming iron kettle and a basket of bread. The smell that filled the loft was rich and savory, a compound of meat, root vegetables, and herbs that made Barker's stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was painful. "Supper," the young guard announced, setting the kettle on a makeshift trestle table. He handed a stack of wooden bowls and spoons to Sergeant Whitaker. "See that it's divided fair. There's more below if it's needed." The sergeant took the bowls, his movements still rigid with distrust. The men gathered around, their eyes fixed on the kettle. The steam rising from it carried the promise of life itself. Whitaker ladled the stew into the bowls. It was thick with chunks of what looked like venison, potatoes, and carrots. It was not the thin, watery gruel of a prison camp. It was a meal. The bread was dark and dense, still warm from the oven. Barker took his portion and retreated to a corner, cradling the bowl in his hands, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He took the first spoonful. The flavor was overwhelming, rich, hot, and deeply satisfying. He ate slowly, deliberately, making it last. He could feel the strength flowing back into him, a warmth spreading from his belly through his entire body. He looked around at the other men. They were all eating with the same focused intensity. The only sounds in the loft the scrape of spoons against wood. The hard lines of fear and exhaustion on their faces seemed to soften in the lantern light. For the first time in months, they were not just surviving. They were being sustained. A while later, looking down through a gap in the floorboards, Barker saw a sight that struck him with more force than any cannonball. Below, in the main part of the barn, the guards were gathered around their own fire. And they were eating from the very same kettle. Their bowls were filled with the same thick stew. Their hands held the same dark bread. The sight was a quiet revolution in Barker's mind. Propaganda and camp rumor had painted the rebels as a desperate, starving rabble. The officers had spoken of them with contempt, as an undisciplined mob playing at being an army. But here was undeniable proof of something else. These people had enough to feed themselves and their prisoners from the same pot. There was no distinction made, no watery portion for the captives while the victors feasted. It was a simple, communal act of sharing what they had. He saw Elias, the gray-bearded leader, talking with the young guard who had brought them their meal. He was not barking orders. He was speaking quietly, and the young man was nodding. It was the discourse of a father and son, or a master and apprentice, not a commander and his subordinate. Whitaker saw him watching. The sergeant moved over, keeping his voice low. "Don't let a full belly make you soft, Barker. This is a performance. They want us to lower our guard, to think them good Christian folk. That's how they'll get at you, through your stomach. They mean to turn you." "Turn us into what, Sergeant?" Hargreaves asked from nearby, wiping his bowl clean with a piece of bread. "Well-fed farmers." "Into traitors," Whitaker hissed. "They'll offer parole, land, a place in their so-called free society. They'll tempt you away from your oath to the king. Every bowl of stew, every clean shirt is a hook. Don't swallow the bait." Barker said nothing. He looked from the sergeant's pinched, certain face down to the scene below. The guards were finishing their meal. One of them began to softly hum a tune, a simple, unadorned melody that sounded like a hymn. There was no menace in the scene, no hidden threat. There was only the quiet order of a day's end, of men sharing food after labor. Whitaker's world of rigid loyalties and clear-cut enemies seemed a brittle and inadequate frame for the picture he was seeing. The warmth in his belly felt like more than just food. It felt like a dangerous, creeping doubt. The days settled into a rhythm that was as unchanging as the winter landscape. It was a routine governed not by the bark of a sergeant or the blast of a bugle, but by the rising and setting of the sun. They were woken before dawn by the stirring of the cattle below. Their breakfast was a simple porridge of oats or cornmeal, sweetened with molasses, and served with hot cider that cut the morning chill. Then came the work. They were not kept idle in their barn. Elias and the other townsmen put them to tasks that the community needed done. They were split into groups, some sent to the woodlet, others to the mill to repair the ice-damaged race, and a few, including Barker, to split rails for new fencing. The work was hard, honest labor that left a man's muscles aching and his hands raw. At the fence line, they were given heavy mauls and iron wedges. An older farmer, a man named Gideon whose hands were gnarled like oak roots, showed them the technique. "Don't fight the wood," he said, his voice a low rumble. He placed a wedge into a notch on a thick log. "Read the grain. Let the tool's weight do the work," he demonstrated, a smooth, practiced swing of the maul that split the log with a satisfying crack. There was no wasted motion, no shouting. There was only a deep, ingrained competence. Barker, accustomed to the precise, repetitive motions of the drill manual, found a different kind of discipline in the work. The swing of the maul, the bite of the wedge, the sharp scent of split oak, it all had a powerful, grounding reality. He learned to feel the rhythm of it, to work with the other men in a silent cadence of swing and strike. Their guards worked alongside them, their own mauls rising and falling in the same rhythm. They were not overseers. They were fellow laborers. Discipline was enforced not by punishment, but by the simple demands of the task. A man who worked sloppily was not flogged. He was simply shown the right way again, patiently. A man who shirked his duties found his food portion no smaller, but he earned the silent disapproval of his own comrades, who had to work harder to make up the difference. The authority was not external, imposed by a lash or a stockade. It was internal, arising from the shared work and the visible, tangible results. The growing pile of split rails, the cleared field, the repaired harness. This was Whitaker's greatest frustration. He could find no fault in their treatment, and this lack of grievance was itself a grievance. "They are unmaking you as soldiers," he would lecture them in the evenings, as they rubbed tallow into their blistered hands. "A soldier's purpose is drill, discipline, the bearing of arms. This is peasants' work. They are trying to make you forget what you are." "What I am right now is tired and hungry, Sergeant," grumbled a fusilier named Price. "And this work gets me fed and warm. That's more than the quartermaster managed for 3 months." The argument would simmer, a constant tension in the hay-scented loft. The hardliners, loyal to Whitaker and the world he represented, saw every small kindness as a carefully laid trap. The younger men, more pragmatic, saw only the reality of their situation. They were warm, clean, and fed. Barker remained in the middle, an observer. He performed his duties, kept his thoughts to himself, and watched. He watched the way Elias planned the day's work with his men, the quiet consensus they reached. He watched the women of the town bringing them a midday meal of bread and cheese at the woodlet, their movements efficient, their faces serene. This was a world built on habit and communal effort, and it exerted a powerful, silent pressure on his own certainties. The Sabbath was the strangest day of all. There was no work. The town fell into a profound quiet, broken only by the tolling of the bell from the meeting house. The prisoners were confined to the barn and the small yard around it, but they were not locked in. The guards were gone, replaced by a single, elderly man who sat on a stool by the gate, reading a Bible. From their loft, they could see the townspeople making their way to the meeting house. They walked not in a grand procession but in small family groups. Their clothes were dark and unadorned. There were no bright uniforms, no flags, no military pomp. It was an assembly of equals, and their quiet passage had more authority than a full regimental parade. Later in the afternoon, they could hear the sound of singing from the meeting-house. The melody was simple, the harmony stark. It was not the soaring, triumphant sound of an Anglican choir in a great cathedral, backed by an organ. It was the sound of human voices, unadorned and earnest, rising together in the cold winter air. Hargreaves, who had a fine tenor voice, cocked his head. "It's a German chorale. Luther, I think." Stern stuff, he began to hum along, and then, softly, he began to sing a different tune, a familiar psalm from the Book of Common Prayer. "The Lord is my shepherd, therefore can I lack nothing." For a few moments, the two melodies intertwined in the still air, the stark, Germanic certainty of the colonists' hymn and the gentler, more ornate line of the Anglican psalm. They did not clash, but braided together in a strange, unexpected harmony. A brief truce of melodies across the frozen yard. The sound hung in the air, a perfect, fleeting expression of their paradoxical situation. They were enemies, and yet their faith spoke in a language that could, for a moment, understand each other. Barker felt a lump in his throat. He thought of his own parish church, of the Sunday service, of the comfortable, unshakable certainty of that world. It seemed 1,000 miles and 1,000 years away. Here, faith was not a matter of state and ceremony. It was the quiet, load-bearing pillar that held up the entire community. The authority they obeyed was not a king's, but God's, and it seemed to require no sergeants to enforce it. The incident that finally fractured the barracks debate was, as Whitaker had predicted, a small thing. Concerned a pair of boots. Edward Price, the Fusilier, had been wearing boots that were literally falling apart, the soles flapping with every step. He had tried to patch them with scraps of leather, but the winter mud had defeated his efforts. He was developing a nasty cough, and his feet were constantly dangerously cold and wet. One morning, as they were assembling for the work detail, Elias came into the barn. He was carrying a pair of sturdy, well-made leather boots, the soles thick, the seams freshly waxed. They looked new. He walked over to Price. "These should be your size," he said, holding them out. Price looked at the boots, then at Elias, his expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. "What for?" he asked. "Your own are finished," Elias said simply. "A man cannot work with wet feet. He will sicken." Whitaker stepped forward. "My men will not accept charity from rebels." Elias turned his calm gaze on the sergeant. "It is not charity, friend. It is practicality. We have need of his labor. A sick man cannot labor. If we were to let him fall ill for want of a pair of boots, the fault would be ours, not his. It would be a failure of stewardship." The word hung in the air. Stewardship. Not charity, not a bribe. A responsibility. Elias was not offering a gift. He was fulfilling an obligation he felt toward the man in his charge, as a farmer might feel toward his livestock or his land. Price looked at his own ruined boots, then at the solid, dry ones in Elias's hands. He looked at Whitaker's furious face, and then he made his choice. He sat down on a bale of hay, pulled off his sodden footwear, and accepted the new pair. He worked them onto his feet, wiggling his toes. A slow smile of pure, physical relief spread across his face. "They're a fine fit, sir," he said, forgetting himself. "Thank you." Elias simply nodded. "See that you grease them each evening. They will last the winter." He turned and left the barn. The silence he left behind was thick with tension. Whitaker stared at Price, his face pale with rage. "You've taken their coin, Price. You've let them buy you for a pair of boots." Price stood up, his footing solid for the first time in months. "No, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "He hasn't bought me. He's just kept me from losing my feet to the frost. There's a difference." The argument was over. A line had been crossed. The abstract principle of unbending honor had collided with the concrete reality of a pair of dry boots, and reality had won. From that day on, the grumbling against Whitaker grew louder, the conversations more open. The men still knew they were prisoners, still longed for home and the end of the war. But the black and white world of the sergeant's speeches had given way to 1,000 shades of gray. They had begun to see their captors not as a monolithic entity called the rebels, but as men. Elias, Gideon, the young guard. Men who worked, who prayed, who ate from the same pot, and who believed it was wrong to let another man's feet rot for the sake of a principle. The moral hinge had turned. The lengthening days of March brought a change in the air. The iron grip of winter began to loosen, and the first hints of a thaw softened the ground. The sun held a little more warmth each day, and the sound of dripping water from the eaves was a constant, gentle percussion. With the approach of spring came a new, restless energy. The thoughts of the men turned more often to home, to the possibility of exchange. The community had a system for small luxuries. For each day of diligent work, a man would receive a small wooden token from Elias. These could be redeemed at a storehouse run by Gideon's wife, a stern but fair woman named Sarah. The inventory was small. A twist of tobacco, a needle and thread, a sheet of paper with a dab of ink in a clamshell. There was no currency, only a ledger where Sarah would make a mark next to a man's name or take his tokens. It was a system built on trust and earned reward. For weeks, Barker had been saving his tokens, resisting the urge for a pipe of tobacco. He wanted to write a letter to his parents in Lincolnshire. He needed to tell them he was alive and well, but the task felt more complicated than that. How could he describe his life here? How could he explain the profound dislocation he felt? Finally, he had enough tokens for 2 sheets of paper. He presented them to Sarah, who nodded, took them, and handed him the precious supplies. He found a quiet corner of the loft, with the late afternoon sun slanting through the gaps in the timber walls. He sharpened a goose quill with his small knife and dipped it in the ink. Dearest mother and father. He paused, the quill hovering over the page. He started to write about the hardship, the cold, the fear. It was what they would expect. It was the proper narrative for a prisoner of war. The winter has been severe, and our trials many. We were captured after the action at Germantown, and have been held in this remote settlement since January. The work is hard, but I am in good health. He read the words back. They were true, but they were also a lie. They told none of the essential story. He thought of the warm stew, the clean shirt, the solid boots on Price's feet. He thought of Elias's quiet competence and the braided hymns on a Sunday afternoon. A wave of something he couldn't name. Guilt, confusion, a strange sort of loyalty to his captors, washed over him. To describe their decency felt like a betrayal of his regiment, of his king. To ignore it felt like a betrayal of the truth. He dipped the quill again, his hand moving with more certainty. Our keepers are not the savages of Camp Rumor. They are a sober, religious people who live by a plain and orderly habit. They have treated us with a firmness that is not cruel. We eat the same fare as our guards, and are sheltered from the worst of the weather. Sergeant Whitaker fears they mean to soften us to their cause, but I see little of politics in their actions. They seem to do what they do from a belief in proper stewardship, as they call it. It is a strange and disquieting country, where a man's worth is measured by the work of his hands and not by the color of his coat. He stopped, a knot in his stomach. He had said too much. This letter would be read by his officers before it was sent on. What would they make of such a description? Would they see it as a sign of a weakening resolve? Of a man who had, as Whitaker feared, swallowed the bait. He put the first sheet aside and started again on the second. This time he kept his words sparse and careful. He wrote that he was well, that he prayed for them and for a swift end to the war. He mentioned the spring thaw and his hope for an exchange. He said nothing of stewardship, or of hymns, or of the taste of warm bread on a cold day. He wrote the letter a prisoner was supposed to write. But as he sanded it and folded it, the words from the first, abandoned draft echoed in his mind. The truth was now a secret he had to keep from his own side. From the Journal of Private Thomas Barker. 3rd day of April, Anno Domini 1778. The ground is soft, and the birds have returned. My hands are now hard with the callus of the axe and the maul, and I find I take a certain pride in a well-split rail. This is a dangerous thought for a soldier. I wrote my letter home, but the words I wrote were not the words in my heart. I feel as if I am two men now. One is the king's soldier, who longs for his regiment. The other is a man who has seen a different way of ordering the world, and is not certain which is the better. To live in such a state of doubt is a heavy burden. The forge was the heart of the settlement, a dark, smoky building from which the constant, rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil echoed throughout the day. It was run by a man named Abel, a blacksmith whose quiet demeanor concealed a formidable strength. He was not one of the town's Moravian elders, but a Presbyterian from further west who had settled here. His arms were thick cables of muscle, and he moved with the unhurried grace of a man who understood the properties of iron and fire. Due to his steady hands and focused nature, Barker was assigned to help at the forge. His job was simple at first, to work the great bellows, feeding air to the coals, and to fetch and carry for Abel. The heat was immense, a dry, searing blast that made the air shimmer. Barker, his face and arms soon smudged with soot, worked the long wooden handle of the bellows, watching the fire bloom from a sullen red to a brilliant, almost white-hot heart. Abel rarely spoke. He communicated in grunts and gestures, pointing with his tongs to the tool he needed, nodding when the iron was at the right temperature. But he was a natural teacher. Barker learned by watching the way Abel drew out a length of iron, the way he folded it, hammered it, judged its heat by the color of the glow. It was a language of craft older than any king or country. One afternoon, they were tasked with repairing a broken chain from the mill. A crucial link had snapped. Abel heated a length of iron rod, and with Barker's help at the striker hammer, they forged it into a new oval link. The work was a duet of force and precision. Abel would place the hot iron on the anvil, indicating the striking point with a small hammer, and Barker would bring the heavy sledge down in a powerful, controlled blow. Ring, turn, ring, turn. The rhythm was hypnotic. When the link was formed, Abel took over for the delicate work of welding it shut. He heated the ends to a fizzing, sparking heat, sprinkled them with a flux of sand and borax, and then, with a few swift, expert blows, fused them into a seamless whole. He plunged the glowing link into the slack tub, and a furious hiss of steam erupted, filling the forge with a momentary white cloud. He pulled the finished link from the water and inspected it, turning it over and over. He grunted, a sound of satisfaction, and handed it to Barker. It was still warm. Barker ran his thumb over the weld. It was perfect, a smooth, strong bond, impossible to tell where the two ends had met. He felt a surge of pride, a sense of accomplishment that was clean and uncomplicated. They had not destroyed something. They had made something whole again. Abel looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of a smile touched his lips. "Good work," he said. The two words were a greater commendation than any praise from an officer on the parade ground. They were the acknowledgement of a fellow craftsman. In that moment, the entire edifice of propaganda and enmity seemed absurdly fragile. Barker was not a British regular and Abel was not an American rebel. They were two men who, together, had transformed a raw piece of iron into a useful, functioning object. They had communicated through the shared language of the hammer, and had found mutual respect in the perfection of the work. This was the human bridge, built not of words or ideologies, but of fire and steel and sweat. It was a connection far more real and durable than the abstract loyalties of a distant war. He saw Whitaker watching him from the doorway of the forge, his face grim. The sergeant didn't need to say a word. Barker knew what he was thinking. You are becoming one of them. And for the first time, the thought did not fill him with alarm. The order came on a Tuesday in late April, carried by a Continental Army dispatch rider on a mud-spattered horse. An agreement had been reached. The prisoners of the 40th Foot were to be exchanged. They were to be marched to a ferry crossing on the Delaware River the following morning, where they would be handed over to a British patrol. The news ripped through the prisoners' quarters like a musket volley. There were whoops of joy, men clapping each other on the back. Hargreaves began to sing a boisterous, off-key rendition of the British Grenadiers. They were going home, or at least, back to the army, which was the only home they had known for years. Back to their red coats, their muskets, their comrades. Back to the war. Barker felt a surge of relief so powerful it made him dizzy. Freedom. The word was a physical sensation, a lightness in his chest. He would see his regiment again. He would leave the strange, quiet valley and return to a world he understood, a world of orders, ranks, and clear duties. But as the initial euphoria subsided, a different, more complex emotion took its place. A strange reluctance, a quiet melancholy. He found himself thinking of the routines that had shaped his life for the past 3 months. The morning porridge, the weight of the maul in his hands, the satisfying ring of the anvil, the scent of hay in the loft at night. He thought of Elias's calm gaze, of Gideon's gnarled hands, of Abel's grunt of approval. He was leaving a world that, for all its strangeness, had a coherence and a quiet dignity that he had come to respect. Sergeant Whitaker was reborn. He strode about the loft, issuing orders, his voice once again crisp with the authority he had nearly lost. "Get your gear in order, what little there is of it. Look sharp. We will march out of here as we marched in. As soldiers of the king, proud and unbroken." Unbroken. The word seemed wrong to Barker. He did not feel broken, but he did not feel unchanged either. Something had been taken from him here, a certain blind certainty, a simple definition of the world. And something had been given in its place. A troubling, uncomfortable, and yet deeply human complexity. He was afraid of returning to the old certainties, afraid they would no longer fit. That evening, as they prepared for their departure, Elias came to the barn. He carried a small sack. He went to each man, and from the sack he gave them a small loaf of dark bread, still warm, and a thick slice of cheese. "For the march," he said. "It is a day's journey to the ferry." When he came to Barker, he paused. "You have been a good worker, Thomas Barker," he said, using his given name for the first time. "Abel spoke well of you. Thee has a craftsman's hands." The use of the plain speech "thee" was startlingly intimate. It was the language of his own community, not the language for an enemy. "Thank you, Elias," Barker managed, his voice thick. For everything." Elias simply nodded, his gaze direct and unreadable. "Go with God," he said, and moved on. Later, as the men settled into a restless sleep, Barker lay awake, the smell of the fresh bread filling the air. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was caught between two worlds, and belonged fully to neither. He was a soldier who had learned the rhythms of a farmer, a prisoner who had been treated with a decency that shamed his own preconceptions. He was going back to fight against men like Elias and Abel, and the thought now filled him with a deep and weary sadness. The morning was cool and damp, a thick fog rising from the thawing earth and shrouding the valley in a soft, gray blanket. The world was reduced to shadows and muffled sounds. The prisoners were formed up in the yard, their small bundles of possessions slung over their shoulders. The entire town, it seemed, had come out to watch them go, standing in the same silent, impassive lines as when they had arrived. Their escort was a small contingent of the same farmer militia who had brought them in. They set off, their footsteps unnaturally loud in the misty quiet. Barker did not look back at the town. He kept his eyes fixed on the back of the man in front of him, trying to re-inhabit the mind of a soldier, to narrow his focus to the simple mechanics of the march. They reached the Delaware River by midday. The fog was even thicker here, clinging to the surface of the wide, slow-moving water. They could hear the rhythmic creak of the ferry before they could see it, a ghost sound emerging from the gray void. A rope, thick and bristling with hemp, stretched from the bank and disappeared into the mist, humming with the tension of the current. On the far side, though they could not see it, was the British Army. Their world. The militia captain spoke with Sergeant Whitaker, a formal exchange of parole papers. The business was concluded. They were no longer prisoners. As Barker waited his turn to board the flat-bottomed ferry, he stood by the river's edge. He unwrapped the loaf of bread Elias had given him. He had not eaten it. He held it in his hands, the warmth long gone, but the solid, honest weight of it still there. It felt like an anchor to the life he was leaving. The ferry bumped against the shore. The men began to file on board, their faces a mixture of relief and anxiety. As Barker stepped onto the rough planks, he looked back one last time. Through a momentary thinning of the fog, he saw the figure of Elias, standing on the riverbank, watching them depart. He was just a shape in the gray, a silent, solitary witness. The ferryman and his son began to haul on the guide rope, pulling the heavy vessel out into the current. The rope vibrated, the deep, humming notes singing through the damp wood of the deck beneath Barker's feet. It was the sound of passage, of a crossing from one reality to another. The Pennsylvania shore receded, swallowed by the fog. Barker looked ahead, into the gray blankness that concealed his own side, his own army. He was going back to the war, to the familiar cruelties and the simple hatreds that fueled it. He would wear his red coat again, take up his musket and follow his orders. He would be a soldier. But as the ferry moved slowly through the water, the humming of the rope a constant, low thrum, he knew that something inside him was irrevocably altered. He could no longer see the world in the simple colors of a uniform. He had lived for a season in a place of gray homespun, and it had shown him a truth more complicated and demanding than any loyalty he had ever known. He thought of the settlement, now invisible behind him, and a final, clear image formed in his mind. It was not of the work or the food or even the people. It was the memory of a single lantern, lit against the dusk, burning with a steady, untroubled flame in a farmhouse window. A small, quiet light in a vast and darkening world. It was a light he knew he would carry with him, a tiny, persistent glow of doubt and decency, for the rest of the war and all the years to come. The ferry slid onward, and the fog closed in.